Hi, thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't watched the last two videos, please make sure you do so before you watch this one. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about some of the interventions that we make and you can make as well when you're investing in land to make sure that you make money when you buy and don't have to wait until you sell to make a profit. You're watching Own Land in Kenya. I'm Solomon Wangwe. Great, so we've bought the land. We bought it for less than the market price, if possible, because we're amazing negotiators. Secondly, we bought in volumes, which means we get a discount. We're basically wholesale buyers. Simple to understand. If you're buying wholesale, it's generally cheaper than buying retail, economies of scale. Thirdly is we make sure our location is very deliberate to ensure that our future valuation escalates a little bit faster than it would normally because of certain interventions independent of ourselves, government projects, private projects, and so on. But beyond that, there are things that we do to increase the value of the land that we sell before we sell. And the fastest way to do that is to make sure you have clean accessibility to the property. We very often grade our roads to our properties. In some cases, it's several kilometers at a time, which can be a costly thing to do, but it's not a lost value. Whatever you spend in creating accessibility, if you do it right, will generally increase the value of your property by at least a factor of 1 to 1.5. Depending on the quality of the surface that you're creating. Obviously, if you're just going to clear bushes and pour marram, it's a very different thing from clearing bushes, pouring marram, creating drainage, pouring cement, pouring asphalt and tarmacking and lining with markings. That's a very expensive endeavor, typically reserved for governments, right? If you as a land seller or a developer have to do that, you have completely, on a quantum level, changed the value of your property, which may or may not work for you at this particular point of time. So creating accessibility is one key thing that we do to instantly increase the value of a property. A property that's inaccessible will generally be less desirable than a property that's more accessible. It's common sense, right? So if you're in a place that doesn't have accessibility yet, it's great for you when you're buying because you can negotiate the price down, which we typically do. Right? It's why we like investing in the places we do. We look for very frontier parts of the country that have no utilities because that ensures that we can buy very low, in very many cases even lower than the market rates because we're good at negotiating and we buy in volumes. But beyond that, we know that if we invest a little bit of money in creating accessibility and bringing some utilities where possible, it gets more valuable and therefore much more desirable to you as a buyer, or if you're the one doing it, for whoever you're selling to. Pretty straightforward, right? The other thing you can do, obviously we do, is make sure the boundaries are clearly demarcated. One of the easiest or more obvious ways to do this, besides the usual beacons, is fencing. We typically do not like to fence our properties because of the kinds of locations we invest in and the timing of our investments. But it's an easy and a simple way to increase the value of a property because that has to do with security. At the very least, it has to do with perceived security, right? And that's a very straightforward and easy way to increase the value of your property before you sell. Again, whatever you spend on fencing will typically increase the value of the property by a factor of its cost, which means you make money. It's not money you're throwing down the drain, but if you're going to increase the property value by so much that you therefore kill your market, it may not make sense to make that intervention at that particular time. Let me explain it a different way. So you've bought the land for $1 million shillings and it has accessibility, which is great, and you spend maybe another 200,000 to fence it off, right? That means you're now in for 1.2 million shillings. But because of the fence, that property is seen to be worth somewhere around 1.4, maybe 1.5 million shillings. And it could be higher depending on who is considering buying. to a lot of people, the security is important enough that they would pay whatever it takes to secure the property, right? But if I'm going to fence a property to the point where the market is not at the 1.5 million shilling level at this time, it may not make sense for me to spend the 200,000 shillings to fence a property. And that is very often the case with companies like our own. We are very deliberate about what value additions and what interventions we make so that we can sell to you now at a price that makes sense. It may not make sense for you to pay 1.5 million shillings in a place like that now. It may make sense in another 2 or 3 years because of everything that's happening in the area. But we as land sellers have to be very sensitive to that because we don't want to price you out as a buyer. And that's just a reality. Another great way to increase value is to connect it to utilities, power, water, sewer system where it's possible. These are very, very extremely expensive interventions to make. And this is why typically these were predominantly done by the government. So back in the 80s, 70s, 60s, and even in the early 90s, and you see this a lot in urban areas, the governments would take care of your roads, tarmac, power, water. It's why you pay the city council for rates and rents, because that usually went into subsidizing the cost for the government. And these are basically, in my view, CSR projects for governments, because it's not a profitable thing for a government to do. It's such a costly thing to tarmac roads and do sewer systems and power and water and all these other things. They could not possibly make a profit by collecting rates and annual taxes from you as a landowner. It's a function of the government to its citizens. And so in the event that you find a place where this is happening, unless it's being done by a government, you're going to be paying through the nose to invest in that area, because the developer or the person who is making these interventions has to recoup the cost, not even counting their profit. So these are things that you could do provided it makes sense for your particular market at that time. It's not something that you do blanket just because you can. You may have the financial ability to do all that on your own, but if you spend so much money adding value that the market cannot afford, what's the point? So you have to be very deliberate about how you do it, but these are some of the ways you can increase the value of a property when you're buying it or immediately after you've bought it, to ensure that you increase your equity or your value position before you sell. And these will very often make your property a lot more desirable when you're selling. It's a lot more desirable to acquire something that's fenced, that has clear demarcation, that has access, than it is to buy something that's off in the bushes with no accessibility, no utilities. You can't tell where its boundary is and so on. It's pretty straightforward and it should be common sense. And I hope that makes sense to you. Finally, I'll end by saying this. We as investors, as land investors, when it comes to selling, and this is something you should think about when you're thinking of selling your property at some point in the future, is we have to leave money on the table for the buyer. So assuming you've done everything I just shared, and your property is now worth, say, 3 million shillings because you paid 1 million shillings for it, even though its market value was maybe 1.5. You added accessibility, fencing, you did a guard outpost, maybe you connected it to power and so on, and now it's worth 3 million shillings. If possible, get a valuation to that effect, because an independent opinion on the value, especially in places that do not have enough data for someone to reference in the public domain, a professional valuation would go a long way in making the buyer comfortable with the value. If it's valued for 3 million shillings, I as a land seller will generally sell it for somewhere around 2.5 to 2.7 million shillings. Why would I do that? Well, chances are I'd sell a lot faster than my neighbor who's insisting on selling at 3 million, because I've left money on the table for you as a buyer. It's worth 3 million, but you're paying slightly less than its market value. And that can be confirmed easily by looking at what the neighbors are doing, or you could even look at its future prospects based on the impending developments, like I mentioned before. If I know that a Lapset Road, for example, is going to pass by there in the next 2 to 3 years, that property will be worth 5, 7, 10 million shillings potentially. I'm okay paying 3 million shillings. But if none of those things are gonna happen, I want to make sure I make money when I buy. So I will try as much as possible to pay much less than the 3 million shillings. And that's something that we do as professional land traders. Again, I should also put a caveat to that by saying that you as an individual investor may not be able to think through these processes as we can as commercial land traders, because we deal with volumes. It's a business at some point, even though we retain some for ourselves. It's a business. We can afford to make a small loss now to liquidate and get into a new project. You as an individual dealing with a single property may not be able to afford that dynamic, but it helps to know how we think so that you're better informed as far as negotiation is concerned and making decisions based on what the property is being offered for. I hope that information helps. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, please do so. Facebook, YouTube channel is up and running. Please subscribe. You can even give us a call, 0700010001. Again, that's 0700010001. You're watching Own Land in Kenya. I'm Solomon Wangwe. Stay tuned for more information on strategic land investment.